Welcome to the Wayne Public Library's virtual author chat. My guest today is Holley Cornetto. Holley is a writer, librarian, professor, book reviewer, and transplanted Southerner who now calls New Jersey home. She's the author of They Are Cursed Like You, published in 2023 by Erie River Publishing, and We Haunt These Woods in 2022 from Bleeding Edge Books. Her short fiction has appeared in magazines such as Daily Science Fiction, Flame Tree Press Newsletter, Dark Recesses Press, and anthologies from Cemetery Gates Media, Erie River Publishing, Dark Ink, and several others. In 2020, she was awarded a grant from the Ladies of Horror Fiction. In addition to writing the Horror Tree's weekly newsletter, she regularly reviews for Publishers Weekly and the Horror Tree. She teaches creative writing at Gotham Writers Workshop and in the online MFA program at Southern New Hampshire University. Welcome, Holley. Please tell us a little more about yourself and your novel, They Are Cursed Like You.
Thank you. I think in terms of me, you covered it pretty well with your bio. I teach, I'm a librarian. I'm one of those people who I'm just curious about a lot of different things, which librarianship is very good for, which you would know. But aside from that, I've been a lifelong learner. I've been a lifelong reader. So I think that the most important thing I can say about myself as a professional, but also as a creative person, is that my love for books and stories started with reading. I always consider myself first and foremost a reader, even before I consider myself a writer. And that's kind of when I was young, I was always carrying around a book. I was always reading something. My mother loved books, and I kind of inherited that love of reading from her. So I think that that's the number one thing that I could tell you about me that's maybe not covered in the bio, is that I just have always loved books and literature. So when it came time to think about writing, I had stories in my mind, but I didn't really know how to get them on paper, how to do these things. And just read a few books that I loved and thought once, can I do this? Like, what if I could do this? And then actually started to try. And that was probably around maybe 2018 when I actually, like, in earnest started trying to write stories to see if it was something I could do. And apparently, it is something I can do. So, and since then, like, it's just been, working on things and more considering myself a writer and doing events and getting these books out. Writing short stories is where I started. So yeah, I think that's me. In terms of They Are Cursed Like You, which I have here, um, this book is kind of a love letter to my childhood in a lot of ways. So there's a lot of things in here about who I was as a young person. I find the horror genre is a heavily male dominated genre often, and when you have coming of age stories with kids who are growing up and facing scary things, it's often a group of boys. Sometimes there's a token girl, sometimes maybe there's two, but I wanted to tell a story of you know females growing up in the South in a certain, environment, which is an environment that I grew up in. You had mentioned in the bio, I'm a transplanted Southerner. I was born and raised in Alabama, and I lived there. I've been in New Jersey about 20 years. So I grew up in Alabama in, certain circumstances, and I kind of wanted to capture my feelings about that in a book and kind of my background. I've always been fascinated by witches as an archetype. I think witches really exemplify everything that society tells women they couldn't be or shouldn't be, particularly in that culture. Witches are rule breakers. They're women who hold power. They're women who can do things, who can influence things. And I think that they can be angry. They can be intelligent. But any time that you look at the archetype of a witch, you see like a woman who is somewhat of a rebel. And so I've always loved witches for that. I always held a place in my heart. And growing up, I was heavily influenced by the movie The Craft. So I loved the craft, and I think even in my book notes, I mentioned like the character of Nancy really just when I was like a young teenager and I watched this movie for the first time, I was utterly fascinated by this woman who just does what she wants and she doesn't care what anybody thinks. And I was like, I want to write something like that, something that's unapologetically, about women and rage and feelings and feeling powerlessness and how you overcome that. So yeah, I think now that I've rambled on, I'm sorry.
It's okay. That's a lot of kind of the background of why you chose to write the They Are Cursed Like You. So thank you. That tells a little bit more about the novel. So you did touch on the genre, the horror genre. How do you approach creating the supernatural elements in your stories to make them both believable and captivating?
So I feel like and I think that the level of magic or supernatural or whatever it is that you're using is going to depend very heavily on your audience. So what people reading, are comfortable with. And I think that it also is going to depend on what serves the story well. So for this story, I wanted power and magic to come at a price. So for me, it was important to have that written into the narrative when you talk about these magic or these supernatural forces, like what makes them work. And for me, it was really important because it's bleak in places because it's horror. It needed to have a price because from in my mind as a creator and even as someone who consumes content, it's always more rewarding when the character has to pay a price for something they really want because you have to stop and you have to think, you know, how far would you go? And, for some people, they would go very far. For some people, they would back off and say, no, it's not worth it. And I like exploring those kind of moral and ethical dilemmas. So for me, in this book in particular, the supernatural was like a means in which to sort of give them something, but at what cost? Now, I've other books, I've had with We Haunt These Woods, which is the other book that you mentioned that came out a few years ago. It also has a supernatural element in it, but the supernatural element in it is never really fully explained. In that book, I use it as part of the mystery. So in that book, there are kids and they're in the woods, and there's something happening that is paranormal or supernatural, and they don't know what it is, and sort of that magic element, that sort of supernatural element that I use in that is in order to kind of keep the mystery and keep the tension. Like they don't know what's going on, the reader doesn't quite know what's going on, and that's intentional. So those are, I guess, two examples of how I've used it in these books.
Okay. Um, so you've touched on witches, but are there any particular myths, legends, or folklore that inspired your world building for the book series? It's a series, right?
Yeah, it's gonna be a series.
Okay.
I'm currently I'm under contract with my publisher for 3 books. This was book one. I'm currently working on developing book two. This one I had a co-author with this book, but unfortunately they had to step away. So it's on me to do everything with the rest of the series going forward, which is a little scary, but also it's I'll do it. But I guess in terms of witches and folklore, like I said, I like the witch archetype and I do devour witch stories. So I think if you're talking about like I think my favorite like traditional kind of witch story is like the Baba Yaga because I like that you never know if she's going to help you or if she's going to hinder you. And I like the house with the chicken feet. I mean, who doesn't like the house with the chicken feet? In terms of things that might have actually directly influenced this, I mentioned the movie The Craft. I think that was a big one in terms of who I wanted the central cast of characters to be. In terms of the setting and things like that, I think there's a lot of there's a certain element here of like a deal with a darker power. That the witches they sign away something of themselves, whether they know it or not, to a darker power. So you can call it a deal with the devil kind of thing. I think that element really played into this too.
Um, Again, you might have touched on these already, but are
It's
there any
okay.
specific themes or messages you aim to convey through your novels?
I mean, in a way, I guess it's my message to women, it's particularly young women, that it's okay to feel things. Like, it's okay to get angry. I when in the time and place I was growing up, you weren't supposed to be angry, and things like that. Like, women are you're quiet and you're demure, and that's just part of the culture I grew up in. And I think that a lot of times I would suppress things like anger and disappointment and negative emotions, particularly, and didn't really learn how to deal with and process those. And for me, this book is was a very cathartic thing. And I think that the message here is, that it's okay for you to be more things, and it's okay for you to be something other than what society prescribes you. I mean, these women are outcasts in pretty much every sense of the word. The characters are poor, they're growing up in a trailer park, they're very destitute, they're scraping to get by. They're picked on by other people. The cast of female characters are almost exclusively queer in some way. So we have lesbian, bi representation, things like that in this book. Which, again, at the time and place I was raised, it was kind of frowned on. And so for me, I think that it's my sort of, I guess, passing down to say, it's okay to be these things. Like, you can, it's all right, and it's actually kind of interesting if you are. And I think that that's probably the biggest message and takeaway in terms of themes. I think that what I try to touch on is hope in dark places. That even though things may look bleak, there may be some redemption there, for depending, because I won't say all the characters in here get redemption, but no spoilers. But I think that it's important too to know that people are complex, and not everybody's all good and not everybody's all bad. And that's one thing that I try to do with these characters, is that they all have good parts and they all have bad parts. And you kind of have to, like, get to know them to see that, and to see that they're very layered people, and that it's okay to be that.
Mhm. Well, I think every person has layers. It's just
Yes.
uh, it's not always easy to convey on the page, but good job.
Yeah. And I think some people in real life tend to hide some of those layers too. Some of the ones that we might think are a little uglier or something. Like, maybe we don't show our full selves all the time. And I mean, there's an argument that maybe we shouldn't all the time. But there's also, like, the don't be afraid to be you and be genuine.
Definitely, if you're talking about teenage girls, I think they hide a lot of who
Yeah,
they
and there's a lot of insecurity there too. And I mean, not for nothing, like, it's hard to be that age, because your peers judge you, you feel like you face with stuff. And that's only like one half of the book, because the other half, the point of view character, is an older woman who she finds out that she has cancer. And she's kind of dealing with regret in her life decisions. So she's looking back at things that she did, decisions that she made, and she's looking back and she's saying, I shouldn't have done this, I should have done this. And she's kind of seeing the things that she would change if she could go back and do it again. So you have this interesting juxtaposition between the older, been there, done that point of view, and the younger, oh, I could do these things. So you kind of see that, like, that mirrored in those two stories.
You kind of mentioned that you're working on the second part to the series, the second book. Do you have any other upcoming projects that you're particularly excited about?
I have a lot more ideas than I have time. But yes, I have a lot of projects. I'm a serial busy person. Like, I always try to throw myself at everything. So in addition to working on book two of this series, I have another novel that's written that just needs to be, like, go through editing and things like that before I start sending it out in publication. I'm also currently running an open call for an anthology that I'm doing with Erie River Press. So it's in collaboration with the press who published me, where we're doing a short story collection. So right now I'm reading through submissions and stories and kind of selecting the stories that are going to go into that book. So those are, like, just a couple of the upcoming things that I've got going on that I'm really happy about.
Okay. Um, so I often say I divide these author chats into three parts. First, we discuss your books, and then I like to cover writing, and last part being publishing. So, in terms of your writing, Can you share any of your personal experience or anecdotes that influenced your writing? You kind of mentioned your growing up in Alabama and how that has influenced, but are there any other things that you think that may have, gotten into the text?
Well, it's interesting because when I first when I used to read as a kid, I read a lot of horror. Like I started with Goosebumps with R.L. Stein, graduated to Fear Street, and then eventually Stephen King, things like that. But when I came to writing, I actually didn't think I was going to write horror to begin with. I thought I'm going to like write maybe like literary fiction or something like that. And I have published a couple of short stories that are like literary fiction, they're not genre. But it was interesting because I always felt like I struggled to write those stories. Like I would have trouble like getting the desire, and I knew I wanted to write, and I knew that, but it just, but then I started writing, I just gave myself permission. I was like, I'm gonna write the story that you want to read, right? That's the common advice they tell writers is write the story you want to read. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to do that. And that's sort of what the seed for We Haunt These Woods was, because it started life as a short story. And so I was like, I'm going to write this. And so I did. And, it went originally was published as a like 7,000 word short story, give or take, in an anthology. And reviewers who read the anthology were like, "Oh, we love this story! Like this story." It was called Forest Man when it was just a short story, and reviewers just always mentioned it, and they were like, "This is great! This is great! This is great!" And I was like, I this is it feels good. Like this is what I wanted to do. I'm getting very good feedback from it. And so at that point, I had already enrolled in a creative writing program and I had to do a project. And I was like, I'm going to take this short story and I'm going to turn it into like a book. Like it just, there's more here. The characters just didn't leave me alone. Like I was just, would find myself like in moments when I was bored or kind of in autopilot mode, like showering or driving or something. And I just think back to them and be like, what else is here? So I think, yeah, for me, that's kind of my journey to, how I got to the point where I was taking writing seriously and to the point where I found my identity as a writer. Now, I also have dabbled in fantasy and I've dabbled a little in science fiction, and I probably will continue to write some fantasy because that's my second love genre. But yeah, I think just coming at it from that perspective and finally giving myself permission to write the stories that I wanted to write. And if there are any like people out there who are considering starting to write and they kind of want to hold back, my I guess my advice or my plea to you would be write what you want to write what feels good, because that's where you're going to have those moments where you resonate with people, because people when you read a book, you connect with the reader. Like it's a directly like me taking what's in my head, putting it on a page, and then you reading it and putting it inside your head, and it's an interesting connection. And it's better when you feel it, like when I think the reader knows, like when they read something and they just feel emotion and they feel that the author really cared about what they were doing. I don't Did that answer the question? I'm
Oh,
sorry.
yes,
I think
absolutely.
I
And
rambled
I
a little.
agree. I agree. They was they often say like write what you know, but I think it's I've tried writing too. I have those manuscripts under the bed. But I loved reading historical romance, but what
Yeah,
came out of me was contemporary. Like was
yeah,
I was like, where is this? But if but you know that because you live in the contemporary world, so and that's
right.
what's coming out. But but when you write that, it shows on the page. The feeling is there, like the emotion is there. That I think
Exactly.
the joy the author has in writing that, like it's not a struggle to get the right words and to get the right feeling into the page. It just flows.
Well, I'll piggyback off what you said for a second, because I do teach like creative writing in several different, and I work with graduate students, and I also work with people who are beginners who've never written before, and they just sign up and they say, I've got a story, I want to write it. And I do hear people asking about that advice about writing what you know. And I think for me, the answer to that is always like, you know more than you think. Like if you're writing like a space opera and it's set, in another like planet or whatever. No, you don't know what it's like to live in space, but you do know the emotions. That your characters are going to feel like the decisions they're going to make. Like what it feels like to feel pain. What it feels like to feel love. Like all these different emotions that you deal with on a day-to-day basis. And when I say write what you know, or when I hear people talking about writing what you know, I think, for me, it's that emotional resonance. Like that's what you know. You know how these feelings feel, and you can channel that into your characters and make characters that are, richer, deeper, fuller than, if you did not tap into those emotions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, so, when you sit down to write, what's your typical writing process?
It varies, depending on like if I'm depending on where I am, I guess. So often, what because my husband also writes. So what we'll do is we'll take our laptops and we will leave the house. We will go to McDonald's and order coffees or Starbucks or Dunkin', whatever's close. Like we rotate between like maybe 5 different places. And we'll set up with our laptops. We'll get a coffee and we'll open them up. And usually, one of the first things I do is I'll often go back and read some of the things that I wrote in the last session. So I may not write every single day. I might write 3 times a week. I might write 2 times a week. It really just depends on what's going on. Um, so it's important for me to get back into that character's voice and to get back into the story. So I'll go back and I'll read for the first like maybe 15 minutes to half hour that we're there. I'll just sit and I'll reread it, and I'll make little corrections here and there, but nothing huge, because I believe in revision as a process, not because I'm the type that if I start revising, I'll never get the thing written. Like I'll just sit and nitpick it to death. So I'll make some wording changes here and there. If I read it and something comes to me, I'll make a note like, oh, I could use this later. I'll make a note there. And then when I get to the end of what I've written, I try to, you know, just get more out on the page. Like usually when I have this process that I call living in the story. So when I'm laying in bed at night trying to fall asleep or shower or driving or something, moments when I'm bored, when I'm walking my dogs, I try to think about the story and try to live in the story in my head. Like it's for me, I see the story playing like a movie in my head, and I know not everyone does, but for me, that's how it happens. So I have to first see what the scene looks like in my head. And then after I kind of play it out as if it were a movie, then I can start to try and get it on paper. But that has to happen. Like I can't sit with a blank page having thought of nothing and write anything worth a crap. Like it doesn't happen. For me, it takes a lot of like quiet time, and boredom is a big thing, because if you're stressed out and you're busy all the time, you don't have time to like think about your story and be creative. So I think a creative's best friend is being bored. So put your phone away, shut the laptop off, just sit there like this for a little while, and just let your brain take over, because your brain tries to like entertain you, so it starts telling you stories. And that's, I think, like the super big part of my process. I don't think enough writers talk about that part of the process. Like we all talk about the mechanics of it, and oh, I use Scrivener, oh, I use Google Dot, or oh, I use this, or I use that. We talk about those technical aspects a lot, but we don't talk about the act of just living in the story and thinking about the story, and how much of the time that being creative is actually about that, more so than like button, chair, words on page.
Mhm. I have to agree with you. And you have described exactly, as I said, I did write many years ago. And that was it. It was a story playing in my head, and I had to get to the computer and write it down. But it was boredom, 100% boredom.
Yeah.
I was doing a job that was not as entertaining as my current job. Um, and, and so I would find myself like wandering, and that was it. That was where the creativity was. And it was a movie playing in my head, and I didn't want it to get too far ahead. I wanted to I would replay,
Yep,
rewind,
I do that
replay,
too. Because
change
you'll
the
make
dialogue.
changes every yes, you will make slight changes every time you watch the scene, and then until you get it right, or until you get it as close to right as you can.
And then get to a sitting position so I could type it out or write it out, whichever was most convenient at the time, and then get it get it into the flow of it. But yes, what you described exactly, I remember exactly. Um, so um, so every author knows that I'm really good at this, but I could do better at this. So what are your strong suits? What craft elements are your strong suit, and which would you say you'd like to be better at?
I think that my character work in general is pretty strong. I usually get compliments on my characters. They typically have strong voices. They're typically, like I said, they're kind of like layered people. I try intentionally to do that. That may be because I like writing about people. So that I think is a strong suit for me. I think that something I would like to be better at is being more aware of the setting when I'm writing. I think that when I'm writing in horror, the two novels, that it's things are happening like da 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 da, da and it's very plot driven. It's very heavy, plot heavy. And sometimes I don't take as much time as I probably should to fill in the small details of the scene. So if we're in a room, we go in the room and they start talking, and I have to be very aware of going back into the scene when I'm revising and adding like details like, well, what does the room look like? Well, what is she holding in her hand? How is she moving? Like, what's her body language saying when she's moving around the scene? So I think for me that's the big one, because I tend to draft skinny. In my experience as a creative writing teacher, I find there are two different kinds of drafts typically. One is the person who drafts very skinny and they have to like fill it out in the revisions, and that's how I write. Other people will write everything and they have to trim. So they'll come with you with like a 90,000, 100,000 word manuscript that needs to be like cut down a bit. So I think for me, it's in the adding. That's the challenge, because that's a lot of when I'm drafting, I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking about what's the point of the scene? What are they saying to each other? What's happening? Instead of thinking, what does the room look like? Or what does the area outside that they're in look like? So yeah, I think for me that's it. That's probably setting and filling in enough detail that the reader can kind of visualize the way that I visualize when I write.
Okay. Yes. I was a skinny writer too. I love dialogue, so I was like, but what room are they in? What does it look like? So
Yeah. I
that makes
think I think we technically call that white room syndrome, when you
okay.
have like characters and they're talking to each other, but you have no idea like what the room looks like or anything like that. Like, and I see it in my students, and I'll call them out on it. I'll be like, this is white room syndrome. Like, where are they? Like, if they could be in like a desert in the middle of the or they could like be in a palace. Like, I don't know. But I say that with love because I'm guilty of the same thing myself.
Do your characters ever surprise you as you're writing them?
Yes, they often do. I sometimes I start so when I started writing this, and I'm gonna try to not be spoilery, but I will say that there was a character who in the original conception of this book was not a very major character. And she's in the book, and she's not one of the point of view characters in the book, but she does have an influence on both characters. And as I continue to write, I love her. She's so many things. And so I decided that, when I went back, and when we were originally drafting this, it was meant to be just one book. It was only going to be one. But then the publisher's like, I think this could be more. And I got to thinking about it, and I'm like, well, I think it could be two. And it's that one character that is like not a major character in this, but she's the one that ties the whole series together. And originally she was just kind of a side character, an annoyance for, one of the main characters. She was just like kind of this like, problem that needed to be solved. And now like she's just grown so much through the writing because her character influenced, both the main characters. And so now in writing the next books, like she has like it's if I'm just bluntly, the whole series is almost like her arc, like her story arc, her character arc. And she started life as a minor character. So absolutely they surprised me because I didn't expect her to be as important as she ended up being. And just, as I was writing her, I'm like, oh, like she did this and she did this and she could do this and she could do this. And, she influenced all these people. So, clearly like she's got this power and this ability to do so. Through her own like just charm, charisma, and then just who she is as a person. So absolutely.
Okay. Um, and how have you developed as a writer over the years?
um, I've gotten more confident. I've gotten, and I mean, that I guess it seems obvious, but like, imposter syndrome is real. Like, even as someone with a degree who teaches creative writing, like I still sometimes I'm like, man, am I up for this? Can I do this? And I've gotten more confident with, my writing and my message. Because I've become more aware of what I'm saying and who I'm saying it to. Because I think that and I don't want to bore people, but like as a writer, um, you have this idea that you're going to put this book out in the world, and you hope people are going to love it, right? But there's always going to be people who the book's not for them, like they're just not your target audience, right? And those are the people who, like, I mean, you see it in genres. Like I write horror, so when I'm doing events, sometimes people come up to my table to be like, "Oh, you have books," and I'm like, "Yeah, I have books. I'm an author." Blah 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 blah. And they're like, "What do you write?" I'm like, "Horror," and you just see the look on their face, like, "No, thank you." And then you see it sometimes with romance too. Like some of these genres get malaligned. So for me, like it was part of trying to embrace that I'm not going to please everybody. I'm not going to make everybody happy, but for the audience that gets it, they get it, and I don't imagine that everyone who reads this book is going to love it. I've gotten some bad reviews. I got some messages on Facebook that was like, "Oh, you're one of those feminist people." And I'm like, "No, I just wrote a book." But you learn to deal with it, and that comes with time. And so I think that's another thing that I had to learn is to grow a thick skin, because in writing you have to have a thick skin. Like you have to understand that everybody has an opinion, and they're not afraid to share those opinions with you, no matter how hurtful they may be. So I think that's one way that I've really developed as a person, because I used to be very timid and afraid to put myself out there. I'm a very introverted person, and I grew up a little shy for various reasons, some of which I've mentioned previously. So yeah, just putting yourself out there and just being like, some people aren't going to like it, and some people aren't going to like me, and that's okay.
Okay, all true and all good. How do you balance your personal life with your writing career?
Oh, a lot of coffee. I don't know. Like I don't I have a really good work life, a hobby balance, I think. So I work in a library, an academic library, as my day job in addition to teaching. And it's a pretty quiet and place. And I love my coworkers. Like it's a very healthy, and I consider like my coworkers and in some instances to be friends. Like we text each other when we're not at work and things like that. And I'm fortunate that I have that, because I know that not everyone does. And they're very supportive of what I do, and those things help in that aspect. And when I come home, it's good because, like I said, my husband, he also writes, so he understands like the importance of sitting down and doing the thing. So it helps that I have a partner who, in a way, holds me accountable, because I read everything that he writes, and then he reads the things that I write, and we give each other feedback, and we'll be like, you should change this, or this is really good, or maybe you could do this with it. And when we get stuck, it's like having an auxiliary brain, where you're like, I don't know what to do about this character. This is the problem, and then the other one will think about it and be like, what if you did this? So it's really nice to have that, and I think that really helps with it because for me, like, the act of writing is also, like, bonding me and making me have a closer relationship with him in that way. And so when I talk about friends and I talk about, like, my husband, like, that's really my social support circle. I'm not a person who's, like, a huge, like, party goer and things like that. I'm kind of a quiet, introverted, like, inside with a cup of tea and a cozy sweater gal. So that's kind of my balance. It helps that when I'm teaching at Gotham at the workshops or at Southern New Hampshire, that I'm talking about writing constantly. So it kind of keeps me in that mindset that even when I'm working, I'm often talking about books. I'm often talking about storycraft. So like most things in my life kind of lean towards storytelling and books in some way. Like it's always a conversation about books and stories, usually.
That's great.
I
That's
think the
actually,
people that know
yeah.
me expect that too. It's like, "Oh, you're the lady who likes graveyards, coffee, creepy stuff, that writes books." I'm like, "Yeah, that's me." You've got me.
That's good. That's a great balance. Um, so as I said, this is the three different parts. So the last part is publishing. So, what was your publishing journey?
So I started with short stories. And I worked on that for well, no, that's not completely true. I tried to write a fantasy romance before I knew what fantasy romance was. So it was like before Sarah J. Maas got big and everything, and I didn't really know what it was. And I tried to write it, and I had no idea what I was doing. And I meandered on for about 20,000 words, and it's under the bed. Same place yours are. It just never, and I couldn't quite put my finger on why I was having such trouble, with writing the story, writing the book. And then I went to short stories because I'm like, you know what? I need to figure out how to tell a complete story. Because I'd get to the middle and I'd kind of peter out, or I'd get towards the end and I'm like, well, I don't know what to do with the end. Like, what do I do? Like, how does this end? I'm not sure. And I found that for me, it was a matter of needing to have more structure in what I was doing. So kind of outlines, whatever that might look like. Like sometimes it's really detailed, sometimes it's just beginning, middle, end, boom, boom, boom. But I needed more structure because when I could do anything, and I didn't know where the story was going, it would go off in this random direction and then it would come back. And like, I'm not telling a story, I'm just playing around. Um, so I think that, having that experience, then I went to short fiction and I wrote short fiction, and that was very valuable because it taught me the shape of a story. So how to, do things like, begin a story, how to keep tension through the middle, how to end a story in a way that felt right for the story, that felt like you had some closure and conclusion. But then it also taught me other things because I wrote some flash fiction, so it would teach me to be very concise with my language. So one of my problems as a writer is I would use a lot of filler words, a lot of filler language. So I would go through and I would cut that. I'm just like, what words are necessary? Cut, 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 cut. And that's probably why I write skinny drafts, is because that time where I focused on word choice and precision. And then that led me to, as I mentioned, when I got into my MFA program, the I was writing short stories, and I didn't think I was going to write anything particularly longer than a short story at the time. But then my thesis project, it needed to be a certain length, and I was like, well, what do I do? And I had been thinking about that short story. I've been thinking about those characters, and I've been thinking there's more here. So I decided, like, I'm going to take this short story and I'm going to turn it into something larger. So that was really my first foray into writing like long form fiction. And then when I did that, I was like, "This is what I should have been doing," because I thought I'm a short story person because I'm pretty good at this, and the novel was not good, so clearly, like, but it was just a matter of going through that learning process and figuring out what I needed to learn in order to advance myself. And part of it was, going through the creative writing program, learning things, doing workshops, seeing what worked. But also part of it was just practicing short stories, just getting that practice in, finishing them even if they were, total garbage and never got submitted and never saw the light of day. Just the act of finishing those stories and not giving up and doing it completely. And every time I did, I got better. And that's kind of like where my journey from, starting to write to now having like a 3 book series coming out is, that's kind of how I got where I am. If that, I don't know, does that answer the question?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, do you have beta readers or editors that play a part in your writing process?
Absolutely. And I would say everyone should. Like if you write, you should have a critique partner or a group or something. So when I started writing, I mentioned my husband. So he reads everything. He's probably often the first person besides me that reads it. So when I have something, because I'm not afraid to embarrass myself in front of him. So if it's garbage, he'll tell me. He'll be like, this isn't, you need to rework this. That is what we will say. So he's the first line of defense. And then I have a critique partner who I met in my MFA program, and we've kept in touch. So we wrote similar things. We had a good rapport, and we ended up in a lot of the same classes. I guess because of shared interests. And he and I do Zoom meetings like every week. So we do them, and we'll meet with each other just to chat about writing and keep ourselves on task. So like, what are your goals for this week? What do you want to accomplish? How far did you get in your writing last week? But he will be the second person that reads anything of mine. So by the time I have my husband's comments and his comments, I'm typically ready to go in and do the next revision. So then it's a big revision. And then after that, it depends on what it is. If it's a short story, I might ask them to look at it and see if I corrected enough that I could send it out. With the novels, that's a whole other process, because then I would seek out other readers in a writing group I'm in. Does anybody want to, read this and critique it? Then then it went to, in this instance, it went to the publisher. I sent it to the publisher. She's like, yes, I want this. I would like to publish this. She sent it to her team of readers. So her team of readers all read it and filled out a sheet with like ideas, suggestions, critiques, things they liked, things they didn't like. And then she read it and she gave her own critiques, the editor in chief of the press. And so then with all that feedback, I go in and I start revising again. So yeah, it was a valuable part of the process, and I will say there are parts of the book that would not exist if it wasn't for that process, because in its original form, it wasn't quite as long as it is now, and it didn't. There are some key moments that are included now that were not there in the original version. So yeah, I do think beta readers and critique groups partners are a huge part of the process. And if you have good people who are invested in you and invested in the story, they will improve your work. Like they will make it better.
Okay. I have to say, I totally agree. Writers groups, critique partners, beta readers, all of the above. All of
Yeah,
the
just
above.
so valuable. And like too, like I can't even say enough like how much I appreciate people who do things like that, because it's a lot of time and it's a lot of effort, and often they're just doing it out of goodwill, or because they love to read stories, or because they're your friend, or what, whatever the case may be. Sometimes you'll read for them in exchange, but it's like it's so valuable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Have heard that from pretty much every every author I've interviewed. Um, how do you stay motivated and committed to the project, especially during revisions and editing?
Actually, funnily enough, revisions are my favorite part. So I know like some people are like, oh, I hate revising this. I like revisions. My downfall is drafting. Drafting is because I am by nature a very indecisive person. So drafting is a nightmare for me because literally anything can happen. I'm in control, and I have to make every single decision of what is going to happen in the book, and that frightens me. So I think for me, once I have the draft down and I've kind of committed to that, it's easier for me to revise, because then I'm adding things, I'm moving things around, I'm making changes, I'm making the wording prettier, I'm just polishing up what I already have, and so for me, I think it takes a lot of the pressure off, because I don't have to think of what happens next. What happens next? It's already there. I just have to make it look better, right? I have to get it ready for you. um, so yeah, I'm one of those weird people, because I know that often the reverse is true, that people love the drafting process, but they don't want to touch revisions. It's like, oh God, I gotta look at this again. But me, I'm like, no, that's actually my favorite part. So I think I'm a weirdo.
No, no, I have to say, and having done this a bunch of times, equal. I'm like always impressed by the
Okay.
people who say, I like revision. Really? Because I
Yeah.
wasn't my favorite part. Um, so
I can see that though. Like I mean, I understand it, especially because it feels daunting. It's like I just finished this book. Oh my gosh. And it's like, oh, but I've got so much more work ahead. So I get it. But I think for me it's just like, okay, the hard part is done. The rest of it's easy.
true. Both sides are equally valid.
Yes. I think it's a matter of personality for that
Yes.
one.
So what advice would you give to an aspiring writer who's working on their first book?
Do it. Finish it, even if it's garbage, even if you don't think that it'll ever be published, even if it's not, you know, objectively good, finish it. Because I didn't finish the first thing I wrote. It wasn't good. I probably should have finished it. One day I keep saying I'm going to go back and finish it, but it's important to do the thing. And once you do it once, you can either go back and revise it, or you can say, okay, I have this experience. Now I'm going to take that and write the next book, right? So you have a lot of authors, like their first book doesn't necessarily get published, like it takes a while, and sometimes it will if they get big, like after the fact. But it takes time and it takes practice, and you have to hone your skills. And so it doesn't matter if it's not good when you start. Like don't even worry about that. I see a lot of writers who they'll write something and they'll be like, I read this novel by like Neil Gaiman and it was so beautiful, and then I look at mine and it's garbage. And I'm like, yeah, but you're comparing a draft by an amateur writer to, a final finished product by an expert who has been through like how many rounds of editing, how many rounds of revision. He's had his editors look at it, he's had like his agent look at it, all these other things. Like, you can't compare your drafting to the novel that you'll pick up at the library, you'll pick up off the shelf at the bookstore. Like, it's just not comparable. There's a lot of steps in the process that gets you from that initial writing of the story to like the publishable product. There's a lot of work that goes in between there. And I think with there may be some exceptions, but most writers, like the first novel they put out is not their best novel. I mean, like I said, there are some exceptions, I'm sure, and there are some people who only write like one novel that ever gets published. But for the most part, for most writers, you get better as you go. So I would say do it and don't be discouraged, even if you think it's not good. It's not going to be good the first time you try. That's just the way it is. I mean, you can't go out never having played like basketball before and expect to be getting 3-point shots. And writing is similar. Like, it's not something that you're born with or you're not born with. Like, that's a big myth, I feel, that people think that, oh, you have to have this certain talent that you're born with to be a writer. Well, it certainly helps if you have talent and you're born with, but you can develop the skills. Like, storytelling and writing is a set of skills that you develop and you practice, just like anything else in your life that you do and that you get good at. And the more you develop it and the more you practice it, the better you'll be at it. And then, after a few years of playing, maybe you can make those 3-point shots.
Yep, absolutely true. Absolutely true. Um, so my final question to you, were there any particular authors or works that influenced your writing style or the theme of your book?
Generally speaking, I think I love I don't know how to word this, so please be patient with me, but I love what Stephen King did for like the horror genre and literature in general, because I feel like he for a while was a very divisive figure in literature where, your people who are a little like I don't want to say snobby about it, but sort of, would look down and say that's not real literature. But he's writing for everybody, right? He's not writing for academics, or he's not writing for, whoever. He's just writing something that, your random, guy can go pick up off the shelf and read and enjoy. So I think that a lot of what I try to write, I try to make it accessible like that. I like to read, I read a lot of YA, and while this isn't necessarily a YA book, it is very YA friendly. I'd say there's like a lot of crossover appeal because one of the characters is a teenage girl. Um, but I like the way that YA authors are direct in their storytelling. You've got your characters, you've got your plot, and you don't, get caught up on overcomplicating things. I mean, plot can be complicated, but I just mean in terms of wording and things like that. Like it's a story that's just well told that you can pick it up and kind of read. And I mean, I love different types of stories, so I do love some literary fiction. I do love, other things. But for me, like the heart of what I try to do is I know I'm never going to have the flowery, beautiful prose of like a poet or someone who writes very lyrical, like beautiful things. So for me, at the heart is just tell a good story. So I often look to people I consider to be excellent storytellers. So I mentioned Neil Gaiman, he's one. I actually am a huge fan of Terry Pratchett, which I mean I know that's fantasy, and I do read a lot of fantasy. I haven't written a fantasy novel yet, but I hope that I will someday. But I like things that are kind of straightforward and just kind of entertaining because I like reading as an escape personally. People read for many different reasons, all of which are valid. But for me, like the kind of escapism that you can pick up a story and get lost in it and just feel like you're with those characters. So I gravitate towards authors that write like that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All great authors, all three that you mentioned, excellent authors.
Well, I have like generally like I'm a big fan of Angela Carter too. And obviously Shirley Jackson. So I wouldn't say that I write like them, but I love their work. And I think that they're so influential that you can't like look at, literature and without mentioning some of those names. Like, I think with King and Gaiman and whatnot that those are more contemporary, examples. Whereas I think that like your maybe your Shirley Jackson and your Angela Carter are a little more dated.
All are still read today. So
Yeah.
I mean, still get new readers all the time. So thank you so much, Holly, for being with us this evening. We wish you the best of luck with your writing, with this story, with the sequel, and anything else you're working on. Um, look forward to having it come out and purchasing it for the library too.
Yay!
But it's been great chatting.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. I appreciate being invited. This is great. Like I love that you do this. Like I think that this is things that libraries and authors like we should be doing. At the end of the day, it's about books. It's about stories. And I think that it's just an amazing thing to be able to share that with people. So thank you for allowing me to share my stories with you and your audience.